Chapter 1. The Breach of Truth. The webway beneath the Imperial Palace had always been a place of whispers and shadows, where the Emperor's greatest work took shape in silence. For decades, the golden corridors had echoed with the measured footsteps of custodians and the hum of ancient machinery, all serving a purpose known only to the master of mankind himself. The tunnels stretched through dimensions beyond mortal comprehension, threading passages between stars that would free humanity from the perils of the warp forever. Yet on this day, silence would be shattered by the desperate cry of a son seeking to save his father from treachery. Magnus the Red knelt within the sanctum of his tower on Prospero, his crimson flesh gleaming with perspiration as psychic energies coiled around his massive frame. The knowledge he had gleaned through weeks of careful investigation burned within his mind like a brand of fire. Horus, beloved Horus, the War Master, their father's chosen heir, had fallen to the whispers of chaos. The corruption ran deeper than Magnus had dared believe, tendrils of darkness reaching into the very heart of the legions that bore the Emperor's name. Time had become his enemy, and distance a barrier that only the most desperate measures could overcome. The Crimson King gathered his power, drawing upon reserves of psychic might that few beings in the galaxy could match. His single eye blazed with determination as he prepared to cast his consciousness across the void, from Prospero to Terra itself. The warning he carried could not wait for astropaths or fleet messengers. By the time conventional communication reached the throne world, Horus's treachery might already have borne its poisonous fruit. Magnus had no choice but to breach every law his father had laid down about the use of psychic power. The Edict of Nicaea meant nothing when weighed against the Emperor's life. His projection tore through the Imperium with the force of a hurricane, psychic barriers dissolving before the urgency of his purpose. Yet the path Magnus chose was not empty void, but the intricate network of passages that his father had been so carefully constructing. The webway's protective wards, those delicate psychic constructs that kept the horrors of the warp at bay, were never meant to withstand such an assault from within their own structure. As Magnus's desperate message blazed through the golden corridors, the ancient protections began to crack and buckle under the strain. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the Emperor felt the tremor that ran through his great work like a death knell. He stood within the primary nexus chamber, his golden form radiant with power, as he guided the expansion of humanity's secret highway between stars. The Webway project represented the culmination of millennia of planning, a path that would lift his species beyond the reach of chaos forever. Yet now, as psychic resonance screamed through the tunnels he had labored so long to perfect, the Emperor knew that something fundamental had changed. The protective barriers shattered with a sound like breaking crystal, and through the gaps came pouring the nightmares that dwelt beyond the veil of reality. Demons of every description flooded into the golden passages, their forms writhing with malevolent joy as they sought to corrupt and destroy the Emperor's greatest achievement. Lesser beings might have despaired at such a catastrophe, but the master of mankind possessed a perspective shaped by 38,000 years of patient planning. Even as custodians rushed to contain the breach and battle cries echoed through the once peaceful tunnels, he stood motionless in the center of the chaos. Magnus's psychic form materialized before his father, the Primarch's astral projection flickering with the strain of maintaining coherence across such vast distance. "Father," the Crimson King's voice resonated through the chamber, heavy with grief and desperate urgency. "Horus has fallen. The War Master serves chaos now, and he brings corruption to our brothers. You must—" The words died as Magnus beheld his father's expression. Where he had expected rage or disbelief, he found only a terrible calm that spoke of decisions being weighed upon scales invisible to mortal eyes. The Emperor looked upon his son, not with the fury Magnus had prepared himself to face, but with the profound sadness of one who sees the ending of an age. "I know," he said simply, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through flesh and soul alike. "I have felt the shadow that has fallen across my war master's heart, and I know that your warning has cost us both more than you realize." The Emperor gestured toward the demon incursion that raged through the webway passages, where his golden guardians fought and died to hold back the tide of corruption. Magnus's projection wavered as understanding dawned in his singular eye. The Webway Project, his father's secret work, he had destroyed it all in his haste to deliver warning of Horus's treachery. The very tool meant to save humanity from chaos had been broken by the son who sought to preserve it. "Father, forgive me. I have ruined everything." The words carried the weight of absolute despair, a recognition that good intentions had paved the road to catastrophe. Yet the Emperor's response was not what Magnus expected. The master of mankind stepped forward, his presence filling the chamber with warmth that pushed back against the chill emanating from the demon breach. "You have ruined one path, my son, but perhaps you have also revealed that the time for other paths has come." The Emperor's gaze fixed upon the swirling vortex of chaos that had replaced his carefully constructed gateway, and in that look Magnus glimpsed something that shook him more than any rebuke could have. His father was weighing whether to abandon secrecy itself. The custodian's battle cries grew louder as more demons poured through the shattered barriers, their golden armor gleaming as they cut down horrors that should never have walked beneath Terra's soil. The Emperor raised his hand, and power flowed from him in waves that drove back the nearest attackers, but both father and son knew that this was a stopgap measure at best. The breach was too large, the damage too severe to be easily contained. Magnus had succeeded in his mission to warn the Emperor, but at a cost that might prove greater than Horus's treachery itself. "The Webway Project can be salvaged," the Emperor said at last, his voice carrying certainties that only one who had planned for millennia could possess. "But not in secret, not with my sons walking in darkness, ignorant of what they fight to preserve." The Emperor turned from the demon breach to face Magnus fully, and in his ancient eyes the Crimson King saw decision crystallizing like fate itself. If the veil must be torn, then let truth itself become our weapon. Summon your brothers, Magnus, all who remain loyal. It is time they learned why humanity must transcend the stars. Magnus's astral form began to fade, as the strain of maintaining the projection finally overwhelmed even his considerable abilities. Yet before he departed, he witnessed his father's transformation from the secretive architect of humanity's future into something far more dangerous, a being who had chosen revelation over concealment, truth over careful manipulation. The Webway Project might be broken, but the Emperor's purpose remained intact. If humanity's salvation could no longer be achieved in shadows, then it would be pursued in the harsh light of absolute truth. The demon incursion continued to rage through the golden tunnels as Magnus's consciousness snapped back to his physical form on distant Prospero. Yet the Primarch knew that he had witnessed something momentous, not the destruction of his father's plans, but their terrible evolution into something that would shake the galaxy itself. The Emperor had chosen to abandon the safety of secrecy, and that choice would transform not just the Webway Project, but the very nature of the war they now faced. Truth, once released, could never be contained again. On Terra, the Emperor stood alone in the Nexus chamber as his custodians fought to contain the breach that had shattered his great work, yet his mind was no longer focused on the immediate crisis, but on the messages he would soon send to his loyal sons. The gathering he was about to summon would witness revelations that no Primarch had ever heard, truths that would reshape their understanding of the Imperium itself. The time for hidden purposes had ended, and with it, the last chance for humanity's evolution to proceed unopposed by the forces that sought its destruction. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The astropathic chambers of Terra had never experienced such urgency as they did in the hours following Magnus's catastrophic breach. The Emperor himself had descended into the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, where his most trusted psychers waited to carry messages across the void. These were not the routine communications of the Great Crusade, nor the standard directives that bound the far-flung legions to their father's will. These were summons that would reshape the very nature of the war for humanity's soul, and the weight of that purpose pressed upon every mind, present like the gravity of a dying star. Robert Gilliman received the message while reviewing supply lines for the conquest of Espander, his analytical mind cataloguing the resources needed to bring another system into compliance. The astropathic transmission struck his consciousness with unprecedented clarity, cutting through the tactical considerations that normally occupied his thoughts. The Emperor's words carried harmonics of power that left no room for doubt or delay. Come to Terra immediately. Bring no legion, but come swiftly. The future of humanity itself hangs in the balance. The 13th Primarch felt something cold settle in his chest as he recognized the weight of absolute necessity in his father's command. Rogel Dawn stood upon the command deck of the Phalanx, watching the bombardment of a rebellious world reduce its defenses to rubble and flame. The Fortress Moon had served as his mobile headquarters for decades, a symbol of imperial might that brought compliance through strength made manifest. Yet when the Emperor's message reached him, Dawn felt the tactical certainty that had always guided him waver for the first time in memory. The summons spoke not of conquest or defense, but of revelation and truth. The 7th Primarch gave orders for the Phalanx to make best speed for Terra, leaving his subordinates to complete the siege without him. Sanguinius felt the call while soaring through the crystalline spires of a world his legion had just liberated from Xenos occupation. The angel had been surveying the damage done to the human settlements, his noble features marked by the sorrow he always felt when witnessing the cost of war. The Emperor's message reached him as he alighted upon a tower that overlooked a city filled with grateful crowds, and the psychic resonance carried undertones that made his perfect features pale. Something fundamental was changing, and the future he had always feared to see in his visions was shifting into new and unknown patterns. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the webway tunnels echoed with the clash of weapons and the inhuman screams of entities that should never have walked within the realm of men. Captain General Constantin Valdor led his custodians in desperate battle against the demon incursion, his guardian spear carving through writhing forms of manifested nightmare with mechanical precision. The Golden Warriors fought not as individuals, but as extensions of a single will, their movements coordinated by a lifetime of shared purpose. Yet for all their skill and dedication, they were losing ground to an enemy that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. The Emperor strode through the chaos of battle like a figure from mankind's oldest legends, his presence alone sufficient to banish the weaker demons that fled shrieking from his radiance. Where his power touched the corrupted passages of the webway, The golden surfaces began to reassert their proper nature, pushing back against the taint that sought to claim them. Yet even the master of mankind could not be in all places at once, and for every breach he sealed, 2 more opened elsewhere in the vast network of tunnels that had been his life's work. Malcador the Sigillite appeared beside his oldest friend with the silent grace that had marked their partnership since the earliest days of unity. The ancient Psyker's staff blazed with silver fire as he added his considerable power to the Emperor's efforts, but his lined features betrayed the concern that gnawed at his thoughts. "My lord," he said, during a brief lull in the fighting, his voice carrying the weight of millennia spent as humanity's secret guardian. "Is this truly the time for revelation? The Webway project was meant to remain hidden until completion. To summon the Primarchs now, to show them what we have built. It risks everything we have worked to achieve." The Emperor's response came not in words, but in a gesture toward the demon-infested tunnels that surrounded them. The Webway project was already compromised beyond easy repair, its protective barriers shattered by Magnus's well-intentioned but catastrophic breach. Yet the master of mankind's expression carried no trace of defeat, only the grim resolve of one who had faced setbacks before and adapted accordingly. "The time for secrecy has ended, old friend. If we cannot achieve humanity's transcendence in shadow, then we must seek it in the light of absolute truth. My sons will understand the stakes, or they will share in the consequences of failure." The first to arrive was Dawn, his flagship translating into the Sol system with the precision that marked everything the Praetorian undertook. The Imperial Fist's Primarch had pushed his vessels to the limit of their capabilities, burning through warp space with an urgency that his legion had rarely witnessed. As the phalanx took station above Terra, Dawn felt the strange sensation that had haunted him since receiving his father's summons intensify. Something momentous was approaching, and his architect's instincts told him that the very foundations of the Imperium were about to be examined and possibly rebuilt. Sanguinius arrived mere hours after dawn, his flagship's golden hull reflecting the light of Sol as it settled into orbital position. The Angel had driven his ships even harder than his brother, sensing in the Emperor's message undertones that spoke to the prophetic gifts that were both blessing and curse. The visions that had always shown him glimpses of possible futures had become strangely clouded since the summons arrived, as though fate itself was being rewritten by forces beyond even his considerable prescience. He prepared to descend to Terra with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Guilliman's arrival brought a sense of methodical purpose to the gathering, his fleet maintaining perfect formation as it joined the growing armada above the throne world. The Ultramarine's Primarch had spent the journey analyzing every possible reason for such an unprecedented summons, his strategic mind cataloguing scenarios and contingencies. Yet none of his theories had prepared him for the strange energy that seemed to emanate from Terra itself, a psychic resonance that spoke of massive forces in motion beneath the planet's surface. Far across the galaxy, on worlds where the Great Crusade continued its relentless advance, other Primarchs received similar summons and began their own journeys toward Terra. Yet not all of the Emperor's sons would answer the call with loyalty in their hearts. Horus the War Master, campaigning in the furthest reaches of Imperial space, received word of the gathering through his network of informants and spies. The corruption that had already begun its insidious work within his soul whispered of opportunity, of a chance to strike at his father's plans before they could fully unfold. The War Master stood within his private chambers aboard the vengeful spirit, studying reports of the unusual activity around Terra, with eyes that no longer held the warmth they once had for his father's works. The timing of this gathering was no coincidence, he realized. Something had changed. Some secret had been revealed or threatened with revelation. The voices of chaos that had become his constant companions urged him to swift action, painting visions of glory that could be achieved if he struck before the Emperor's newest stratagem could bear fruit. Within the webway beneath Terra, the battle raged on with desperate intensity as more custodians fell to defend passages that might prove the key to humanity's survival. The Emperor fought alongside his guardians, his power blazing like a star as he sought to contain the breach that threatened everything he had built. Yet even as he battled the immediate crisis, part of his vast consciousness was already turning toward the revelations he would soon share with his loyal sons. The time for hidden truths was ending, and with it, the last chance for humanity's evolution to proceed without opposition from the very forces that sought its destruction. The gathering storm that would determine mankind's fate was drawing its first participants to Terra, each arrival bringing the moment of revelation closer. Within hours, the Emperor would stand before his most trusted sons and reveal truths that had been hidden since before the birth of the Imperium itself. The Webway project might be compromised, but the vision that had driven its creation remained as vital as ever. If humanity's transcendence could no longer be achieved in secret, then it would be pursued with the full knowledge and commitment of those who had always fought for the Emperor's dream of a better future. Chapter 3. The Weight of Millennia. The Emperor's private sanctum had remained unchanged for millennia, a chamber carved from living rock deep beneath the imperial palace, where no soul save his own was permitted to tread. Here, surrounded by artifacts that predated human civilization and tomes written in languages that had died with the species that created them, the master of mankind prepared himself for the greatest revelation in the history of his species. The demon incursion still raged in the webway tunnels below, but for this moment he had withdrawn from that battle to ready himself for another kind of warfare, the conflict between truth and the comfortable lies that had sustained humanity through its darkest hours. The Emperor stood before an ancient mirror whose surface reflected not light, but memory itself, and in its depths he saw the faces of those who had made his existence possible. The shamans of prehistoric Earth gazed back at him across the centuries, their eyes holding the wisdom of ages and the terrible resolve of those who had chosen sacrifice over survival. Their collective choice echoed through his consciousness like a wound that had never properly healed, reminding him of the price that had been paid to create the being he had become. They had died so that humanity might live, and now the moment approached when their sacrifice would either be vindicated or rendered meaningless. He remembered the ritual as though it had occurred yesterday rather than 38,000 years ago. The shamans had gathered in a sacred grove beneath stars that no longer shone, their weathered faces marked by the knowledge of what was coming. They had felt the warp's corruption growing stronger with each passing generation, consuming the souls of their kind, until reincarnation became impossible, and their ancient wisdom faced extinction. Rather than watch humanity fall prey to the entities that dwelt beyond the veil of reality, they had chosen to pool their spiritual essence into a single vessel that could guide their species through the darkness ahead. The Emperor closed his eyes and felt their final moments surge through his memory like a tide of bitter wine. One by one, the shamans had raised cups filled with poison to their lips, their souls flowing into the Imperium in a rush of psychic power that overwhelmed the demons seeking to devour them. The collective consciousness that emerged from their sacrifice possessed knowledge accumulated over millennia, wisdom earned through countless lifetimes of service to humanity's survival. Yet it also carried the weight of their deaths, a burden that grew heavier with each passing century, as the Emperor witnessed the cost of the choices he was forced to make. The sound of approaching footsteps drew the Emperor from his reverie as Guilliman entered the outer chamber of the sanctum, his measured tread speaking of the methodical nature that had made him master of half the galaxy. The 13th Primarch paused at the threshold, sensing something profound in the atmosphere that surrounded his father's dwelling place. Behind him came Dawn, the Praetorian's golden armor, bearing fresh scars from the siege he had abandoned to answer the summons, and Sanguinius, whose perfect features carried traces of the prophetic visions that had haunted his journey to Terra. The three Primarchs exchanged glances as they felt the weight of their father's presence pressing against their consciousness like the gravity of a neutron star. They had stood before the Emperor countless times throughout their lives, but never had his proximity carried such an undercurrent of ancient sorrow and terrible purpose. Guilliman's analytical mind sought to categorize the change he sensed, while Dawn's warrior instincts prepared for threats he could not yet identify. Only Sanguinius seemed to understand that they stood on the threshold of transformation, his prescient gifts showing him fragments of futures that defied comprehension. "My sons!" The Emperor's voice resonated through the chamber as he emerged from his inner sanctum, his golden form radiating power that made the air itself shimmer with potential. "You have answered my summons with the loyalty that has always marked your service. Yet what I must now ask of you goes beyond duty or obedience. I require your understanding, your acceptance of truths that will challenge everything you believe about our purpose in this galaxy." The Primarchs knelt in unison, but their father gestured for them to rise, his expression carrying a weight that spoke of decisions that would reshape the very foundations of the Imperium. Magnus the Red materialized within the chamber without warning, his astral projection flickering with the strain of maintaining coherence across such vast distances, while simultaneously coordinating his legion's activities on distant Prospero. The Crimson King's single eye fixed upon his father's face, searching for the rage he had expected to find there since his catastrophic breach of the webway's defenses. Yet instead of fury, Magnus found only a profound sadness that seemed to encompass all the failures and tragedies that had marked humanity's long struggle toward ascendance. "I have come to face judgment for my transgression," Magnus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute remorse. "The Webway project lies in ruins because of my haste to warn you of Horus's corruption. I accept whatever punishment you deem fit, Father. My failure has cost humanity its chance at transcendence." The other Primarchs stirred at these words, suddenly understanding that the summons they had answered was connected to some great calamity that had befallen their father's secret works. The Emperor stepped forward and placed a hand upon Magnus's translucent shoulder, his touch somehow granting substance to the psychic projection. "Your transgression opened a door that I had hoped to keep closed until humanity was ready to walk through it safely. Yet perhaps the time for such caution has passed. Perhaps the moment has come when my sons must know the truth of what we fight to preserve." The Emperor's gaze encompassed all four Primarchs as he prepared to speak words that would shatter their understanding of their own origins and purpose. "I am not what you believe me to be," the Emperor began, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through flesh and bone alike. "I am not some singular being born to guide humanity through divine providence. I am the collective consciousness of 10,000 shamans who chose death so that their species might have a chance at survival. Their souls were woven together in a ritual of sacrifice that created something new, a being with the accumulated wisdom of ages and the power to guide humanity through the darkness that threatened to consume it. Guillemon's strategic mind reeled as the implications of this revelation cascaded through his thoughts like an avalanche of restructured understanding. Dawn's expression remained stoic, but his grip tightened on the pommel of his chainsword as he processed the magnitude of what his father had revealed. Sanguinius felt tears of comprehension gathering in his eyes as visions of the ancient ritual flickered through his prescient consciousness. Magnus alone seemed unsurprised, his vast knowledge having already led him to suspect something approaching this truth. For 38,000 years, I have carried the memories of those who died to create me. The Emperor continued, his voice growing heavy with the weight of millennia. I have watched empires rise and fall, seen humanity climb toward greatness, only to stumble into barbarism again and again. The age of strife taught me that conventional leadership would never be sufficient to lift our species beyond the reach of chaos. Only through transcendence, through evolution into something greater than what we have been, can humanity hope to survive the trials that await us. The chamber fell silent as the four Primarchs absorbed the magnitude of their father's confession. They had always known that the Emperor was ancient beyond mortal comprehension, but to learn that he was not one being but many, not a god but a sacrifice made manifest, fundamentally altered their perception of the war they had been fighting. The Imperium they had helped to build was not the creation of divine will, but the desperate gambit of beings who had given everything to ensure their species' survival. The Webway project was meant to be the culmination of that sacrifice, the Emperor said, his gaze turning toward the distant tunnels where his custodians still battled to contain the demon incursion. Within its passages, humanity could have evolved into a fully psychic species without fear of chaos corruption. We would have transcended our limitations and achieved a golden age that surpassed even the heights reached by the ancient Eldar. Yet Magnus's warning, necessary though it was, has forced us to confront the possibility that such transcendence may no longer be achievable through secrecy and careful manipulation. Sanguinius stepped forward, his wings rustling as he moved, and placed a hand over his heart in a gesture of absolute devotion. Father, whatever form your plan must take, whatever sacrifices are required, we will follow you. The truth of your origins does not diminish our loyalty. It only makes us more determined to see your vision realized. The angel's words carried the weight of prophecy, as though he spoke not just for himself, but for all who would choose humanity's future over its comfortable present. The Emperor looked upon his loyal sons and saw in their faces the reflection of the shamans who had died to create him. They possessed the same willingness to sacrifice for something greater than themselves, the same understanding that true victory often required paying prices that lesser beings would find unacceptable. The revelation he had shared was only the beginning. Soon they would learn the full scope of what had been attempted, and what might still be achieved if they possessed the courage to walk a different path toward transcendence. Then you must understand, the Emperor said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had guided humanity through its darkest hours, that the time for hidden purposes has ended. If we are to succeed where others have failed, it will be through truth rather than deception, through unity forged in the light of absolute knowledge rather than the shadows of comfortable ignorance. The Webway may be compromised, but the dream it represented remains within our grasp, if we have the strength to seize it. Chapter 4. The Webway Unveiled. The descent into the Webway began at a portal hidden behind layers of psychic wards that had protected the Emperor's greatest secret for decades. The assembled Primarchs, followed their father through passages carved from living light itself, their enhanced senses struggling to comprehend the nature of the tunnel network that stretched away into impossible distances. Here was architecture that predated human civilization by millions of years, corridors that existed between the spaces of real dimensions and offered passage through the galaxy without touching the nightmare realm of the warp. Yet now these golden pathways echoed with the sounds of battle as custodians fought to prevent demon incursions from spreading throughout the entire network. The Emperor moved through the webway passages with the confidence of one who had walked these routes for decades, his radiant presence causing the tunnel walls to pulse with renewed brilliance wherever his power touched them. Behind him, the four Primarchs experienced their first glimpse of the vision that had consumed their father's efforts since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. Magnus understood immediately what he was seeing, his knowledge of dimensional science allowing him to grasp the staggering scope of what had been attempted. The others followed in awed silence, their minds struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the infrastructure that had been hidden beneath their very feet. "Behold the true purpose of our conquest," the Emperor said, as they entered a vast nexus chamber, where dozens of passages converged like the spokes of an enormous wheel. "Every world we have brought to compliance, every system that has sworn allegiance to the Imperium, all of it was preparation for this moment when humanity would take its place within a network of tunnels that spans the entire galaxy." The chamber itself defied easy description, its walls curving away into distances that seemed to violate the basic principles of geometry while maintaining perfect structural integrity through forces that operated outside conventional physics. Gilliman's analytical mind immediately began cataloguing the tactical implications of what he was witnessing. Transportation networks that bypassed the warp entirely would revolutionize everything from supply lines to strategic deployment, eliminating the risks that made interstellar warfare such a precarious endeavor. Yet even as his thoughts raced through the possibilities, he could see the evidence of catastrophic damage that had been inflicted upon the tunnel system. Entire sections showed the scorching of demon fire, while others had been sealed with emergency bulkheads to prevent further corruption from spreading through the network. Dawn stepped toward one of the sealed passages and placed his gauntleted hand against the golden surface that barred access to the damaged sections. His fortress builder's instincts told him that the barriers were holding for now, but they represented temporary measures rather than permanent solutions. The Praetorian could see stress fractures in the surrounding walls where the psychic shock of Magnus's breach had propagated through the entire structure, weakening joints that had remained stable for millennia. "The damage is extensive," he observed, his voice carrying the weight of professional assessment. "How much of the network remains intact?" The Emperor's expression grew somber as he gestured toward displays that showed the current state of the Webway project in schematic form. Red indicators marked dozens of passages that had been lost to demon incursion or structural collapse, while amber warnings highlighted sections that remained functional but compromised. "Perhaps 60% of what we had achieved remains accessible," he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of decades of labor reduced to ruins in a single catastrophic moment. Yet even that represents a network spanning hundreds of star systems, pathways that could have carried humanity to every corner of the galaxy, without exposing a single soul to the predations of chaos. Sanguinius moved to the center of the Nexus chamber and spread his wings, allowing the prophetic gifts that marked his nature to flow freely through his consciousness. The angel's perfect features took on an expression of transcendent wonder as visions of what might have been flooded through his awareness. He saw humanity spread throughout the webway like blood flowing through veins, carrying civilization to worlds that had never known the touch of conscious thought. Entire populations moved safely between stars, their children growing up in tunnels of light where the corruption of the warp could never reach them. "I see it," Sanguinius whispered, his voice filled with awe at the scope of the vision that had driven his father's efforts. Humanity ascendant. Not through conquest, but through transcendence. Worlds connected by passages of pure thought, where travel becomes as simple as stepping from one room to another. The Great Crusade was never about domination. It was about preparation for this golden age, when our species would inherit the galaxy as its rightful custodians. The angel's visions showed him glimpses of technologies that would have been developed within the webway's protection, advances that would have elevated human civilization beyond anything achieved by the ancients. Magnus's astral form flickered with renewed intensity as he studied the damaged sections of the network, his considerable knowledge of dimensional mechanics revealing the true scope of what his warning had cost. The breach he had created was not simply a hole in the tunnel walls, but a fundamental disruption of the psychic matrices that held the entire system together. Yet even as guilt threatened to overwhelm him, the Crimson King began to see patterns in the damage that suggested possibilities for repair and reconstruction. "Father," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and desperate determination. "The network is wounded, but not dead. With sufficient power and proper techniques, much of what was lost could be restored." The Emperor turned to study his son with eyes that seemed to look directly into the depths of Magnus's soul. The power required would be enormous, and the techniques necessary remain largely theoretical. Yet you are correct that restoration is possible, if we possess the will to pay the price such work would demand. The Master of Mankind gestured toward a section of the Nexus where custodians could be seen fighting to hold back demon incursions that pressed against emergency barriers. The immediate crisis must be contained before any reconstruction can begin, and that will require sacrifices from all who serve humanity's future. Gilliman stepped forward, his strategic mind already working to understand the logistical challenges that would be involved in any restoration effort. The resources needed would be staggering. Entire forge worlds dedicated to producing the materials, fleets of ships to transport workers and equipment, legions of psychers to provide the psychic energy for reconstruction. Yet if successful, the benefits would transform the very nature of the Imperium. The Ultramarine's Primarch could see supply chains that stretched across the galaxy, fed by webway passages that made interstellar commerce as reliable as planetary trade. The Emperor nodded slowly, acknowledging both the scope of the challenge and the magnitude of the potential rewards. This was always meant to be humanity's inheritance, not the stars themselves, but the means to walk between them safely. The Eldar built this network during the height of their civilization, but they never understood its true potential. They used it as a convenience rather than a foundation for transcendence. We would have done better. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the conviction of one who had spent millennia planning for this moment of revelation. Dawn examined the structural details of the tunnel walls with the eye of a master architect, noting how the golden surfaces seemed to respond to the presence of human consciousness by growing brighter and more stable. "The network recognizes us," he observed, wonder creeping into his normally stoic voice. "It was built by aliens, yet it accepts humanity as its rightful inheritors." The Praetorian could see how human expansion through the webway would have been welcomed by the tunnels themselves, the infrastructure actively supporting the growth of civilization within its protective embrace. The sound of renewed battle echoed from one of the damaged passages as custodians fought to prevent a particularly aggressive demon incursion from breaking through their defensive lines. The Emperor's attention immediately focused on the crisis, his power flowing out to reinforce the barriers that held back the tide of corruption. Yet even as he dealt with the immediate threat, his consciousness remained engaged with his sons, sharing with them the full scope of the vision that had driven the Webway project from its inception. "Observe and understand," the Emperor commanded as he gestured toward holographic displays that showed the network's intended expansion throughout human space. Every passage would have been a sanctuary, where our people could evolve beyond the limitations that have always constrained our growth. Within these tunnels, humanity would have developed psychic abilities that rivaled those of the Eldar at their peak, but without the vulnerability to chaos corruption that ultimately destroyed their civilization. The displays showed populations growing and flourishing within the Webway's protection, their descendants bearing gifts that would have made them the true inheritors of the galaxy. Magnus studied the expansion plans with growing understanding of what his father had been attempting to achieve. The Webway project was not simply about transportation or even protection from chaos. It was about creating a controlled environment where human evolution could be guided and shaped according to a design that would produce beings capable of challenging the very gods of the warp. "You are creating a new species," he breathed, awe and horror warring in his voice as he grasped the true scope of the plan. Not through genetic manipulation, but through environmental pressure and psychic development over generations. The Emperor's acknowledgement was accompanied by a sadness that seemed to encompass all the possibilities that had been lost when the Webway's defenses were breached. Humanity's potential has always been limitless, but our environment has constrained that potential within boundaries that serve the interests of chaos, rather than our own growth. The Webway would have provided a space where we could transcend those limitations and become something greater than what we have ever been. His words carried the weight of millennia, spent planning for a future that might now never come to pass. Sanguinius felt tears gathering in his eyes, as his visions showed him glimpses of the children who would have been born within the Webway's protection, their minds capable of comprehending truths that remained hidden from ordinary human consciousness. "They would have been beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with mourning for a future that existed now only in the realm of possibility. Our descendants within the golden tunnels would have inherited not just the stars, but understanding of what lies beyond them. They would have been humanity perfected. The chamber fell silent as the 4 Primarchs absorbed the full magnitude of what had been attempted and what had been lost. The Webway project represented more than infrastructure or even strategy. It embodied a vision of human transcendence that would have elevated their species beyond anything that had ever existed in the galaxy. Yet even in its damaged state, the network remained a testament to the scope of their father's planning and the possibilities that might still be achieved if they possessed the courage to rebuild what had been broken. Chapter 5. The Golden Throne's Secret. The chamber that housed the Golden Throne had always been a place of mystery and reverence, where even the most trusted servants of the Emperor dared not tread without explicit permission. Yet now the 4 Primarchs walked beside their father through corridors that led to the very heart of the Imperial Palace, their footsteps echoing against walls that hummed with barely contained power. The Webway passages they had just witnessed were merely the foundation for something far more ambitious, a device that would serve as both anchor for humanity's transcendence and lighthouse to guide their evolution through the treacherous waters of psychic development. The Emperor paused before the massive doors that sealed the throne chamber, his hand resting upon barriers that had been wrought from materials that predated human civilization. "What you are about to see represents the culmination of knowledge gathered across 10,000 lifetimes, he said, his voice carrying the weight of the shamans whose memories lived within his consciousness. The Golden Throne is not merely a seat of power. It is a machine designed to reshape the very nature of human consciousness itself. The doors swung open with a sound like distant thunder, revealing the chamber beyond in all its terrible majesty. The Golden Throne rose from the center of the vast chamber, like a monument to humanity's ambitions, its Baroque architecture incorporating technologies that seemed to blur the line between science and art. Cables and conduits of exotic matter snaked away from the central structure, connecting it to systems that extended throughout the Imperial Palace and beyond. Yet it was not the throne's physical presence that struck the Primarchs with awe, but the psychic resonance that emanated from its crystalline matrices, a harmony of frequencies that spoke to the deepest levels of human consciousness and promised transformation beyond mortal understanding. Guilliman studied the technical specifications that his enhanced perception allowed him to discern within the throne's structure, his analytical mind racing to comprehend the scope of what had been constructed. The device was not simply a chair or even a control system. It was an interface between human consciousness and forces that operated on scales that defied conventional understanding. "The complexity is staggering," he breathed, his voice filled with wonder at the engineering achievement he was witnessing. This machine could coordinate psychic energies across entire star systems, guide the development of billions of minds simultaneously. The Emperor approached the throne with the reverence of one who understood both its potential and the price that its operation would demand. "From this seat, I would have overseen humanity's evolution into a fully psychic species," he explained, his golden form reflecting in the throne's polished surfaces. "Not through crude genetic manipulation or forced mutation, but through careful guidance that would unlock the potential that already exists within every human soul." His hand traced patterns across control surfaces that responded to his touch with cascades of light, revealing interfaces that had been designed for consciousness rather than mere physical interaction. Sanguinius stepped closer to the throne, his prophetic gifts allowing him to perceive echoes of the futures that the device had been designed to create. The angel saw visions of humanity spread throughout the galaxy, their minds linked by psychic bonds that transcended the limitations of distance and time. Each human being would possess abilities that made the current psyker population seem primitive by comparison, yet they would be protected from chaos corruption by the webway's barriers and the throne's guiding influence. "You would have become the conductor of a symphony that encompassed our entire species," Sanguinius said, awe resonating through his perfect voice. Magnus's astral form flickered with renewed intensity as he studied the throne's psychic matrices, his vast knowledge of the Imperium allowing him to understand mechanisms that remained opaque to his brothers. The device represented the marriage of Eldar psychic technology with human ingenuity, creating something that neither species could have achieved alone. Yet it was the role that Magnus himself was clearly meant to play that filled him with both wonder and terrible responsibility. "I was to be your lieutenant in this work," he realized, his voice heavy with understanding of what had been lost. "My psychic gifts were never meant for war. They were tools for shaping the consciousness of an entire species." The Emperor nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth that Magnus had grasped with characteristic insight. "Your role would have been crucial to humanity's transcendence. While I maintained the overall pattern and guided the species-wide transformation, you would have served as the bridge between individual consciousness and the greater harmony we sought to create." The Emperor gestured toward secondary interfaces that surrounded the main throne, control systems that had been designed for a consciousness as powerful and sophisticated as Magnus's own. Together, we would have overseen the birth of a new form of human existence. Dawn examined the defensive systems that had been integrated into the throne chamber, his fortress builder's mind immediately recognizing the strategic challenges that such an undertaking would have presented. The Praetorian could see how the chamber was designed to be the ultimate redoubt, a position that could be defended against any conceivable attack, while its occupant remained focused on the delicate work of guiding human evolution. The logistics of defending such an operation would have been enormous, he observed, his voice carrying the weight of professional assessment. Every resource of the Imperium would have been committed to protecting this single location. The Emperor acknowledged Dawn's analysis with the gravity of one who had spent decades planning for every contingency that such an ambitious project might face. The Great Crusade itself was preparation for that defense, he revealed, his words carrying implications that reframed the entire purpose of their galactic conquest. Every world brought to compliance, every Xenos threat eliminated, every human population united under Imperial rule. All of it was designed to create a sphere of influence vast enough and secure enough to protect humanity during its most vulnerable period of development. The scope of the revelation struck the assembled Primarchs like a physical blow as they realized that everything they had accomplished, every battle they had fought, and every world they had conquered had been in service of this single transformative moment. The Imperium they had built was not an end in itself, but merely the foundation for something far greater, a cocoon within which humanity could undergo metamorphosis into a form of existence that would make them masters of the galaxy, in truth rather than merely in aspiration. Guilliman's strategic mind reeled as he recalculated everything he thought he understood about Imperial doctrine and policy. The Codex Astartes, the administrative systems I've been developing, none of it was meant to be permanent, he said, his voice filled with the wonder of understanding dawning. They were transitional measures designed to maintain stability during the transformation period. The Ultramarines Primarch could see how his carefully crafted governmental structures would have evolved to support a psychically linked human population rather than the scattered and disparate worlds they currently governed. The Emperor moved to a series of displays that showed the intended timeline for humanity's evolution, charts and projections that had been calculated with precision that only millennia of planning could achieve. The process would have taken centuries to complete, he explained, his voice carrying both the patience of ages and the urgency of opportunity that might never come again. Generation by generation, the psychic potential within human bloodlines would have been awakened and refined, guided by the throne's influence and protected by the webway's barriers from the predations of chaos. Magnus studied the evolutionary projections with growing understanding of the role that had been intended for him and others like him. The current Psyker population would have served as the seed from which a new form of human consciousness would grow, their abilities refined and expanded until every child born within the Imperium possessed gifts that currently manifested in less than 1% of the population. "We would have been shepherds," he breathed, his voice filled with awe at the scope of the responsibility that had been envisioned. "Guides for a transformation that would elevate our entire species beyond anything that has ever existed." Sanguinius felt tears gathering in his eyes as his visions showed him glimpses of the children who would have been born during the later stages of the project, their minds capable of perceiving dimensions of reality that remained hidden from ordinary human consciousness. They would have inherited the galaxy not through conquest but through understanding, he whispered, his voice filled with mourning for a future that existed now only in the realm of possibility. Our descendants would have walked among the stars as easily as we walk upon Terra, their consciousness spanning distances that humble even our fastest ships. The chamber fell silent as the 4 Primarchs absorbed the full magnitude of what the Golden Throne represented and what its operation would have meant for the future of their species. The device was not simply a tool of power, but the key to humanity's ultimate destiny, a machine that could transform an entire species from within while protecting them from the very forces that had destroyed every other attempt at psychic transcendence the galaxy had ever witnessed. Yet even as they marveled at its potential, they could not forget that Magnus's breach of the webway had rendered much of the project's foundation unstable or unusable. The Emperor stood before his greatest creation, with the expression of one who saw both infinite possibility and tragic loss reflected in its golden surfaces. "The throne remains functional," he said at last, his voice carrying certainties that only one who had planned for millennia could possess. "But the Webway project's damage has altered the parameters within which it must operate. The transformation we envisioned may still be possible, but it will require different methods, and perhaps a greater price than any of us had anticipated." His words carried the weight of decisions yet to be made, and sacrifices that had not yet been calculated. Dawn stepped forward, his architect's mind already working to understand the defensive challenges that would be involved in protecting the throne during any future operation. If the Webway cannot provide the protection we had planned to rely upon, then we must find other means of shielding the transformation process from chaos interference, he said, his voice carrying the determination that had made him the Imperium's greatest fortress builder. The logistics will be staggering, but they are not impossible. The Golden Throne hummed with potential as the Emperor and his sons contemplated the future that might still be achieved, despite the setbacks they had suffered. The device represented more than machinery or even strategy. It embodied the hope that humanity could transcend its limitations and claim its rightful place among the galaxy's ascendant species. Yet realizing that hope would require courage, sacrifice, and unity of purpose on a scale that even the Great Crusade had not demanded, the transformation of an entire species was not a task that could be undertaken lightly, but it remained within the realm of possibility for those who possessed the will to see it through. Chapter 6. The Chaos Revelation. The Emperor's expression grew somber as he prepared to share truths that would shatter his sons' understanding of the war they had been fighting throughout their entire existence. The Golden Throne hummed with potential energy around them, its crystalline matrices reflecting the weight of knowledge that had been gathered across millennia of observation and analysis. What the Primarchs were about to learn would redefine not just their mission, but their comprehension of the very forces that threatened to destroy everything they had worked to build. The enemy they faced was not merely alien or hostile, it was parasitic, feeding upon the very essence of human consciousness itself. "The beings you know as the Chaos Gods are not gods at all," the Emperor began, his voice carrying the authority of one who had witnessed their birth and growth across the ages. "They are psychic constructs, born from the collective unconscious of sentient species, given form and power by the emotions and thoughts that pour into the warp from every thinking mind in the galaxy." The revelation struck the assembled Primarchs with the force of a revelation that redefined their understanding of the supernatural entities they had been taught to fear and hate above all other threats to human survival. Gilliman's analytical mind immediately began cataloguing the implications of this knowledge, his strategic thinking recoiling from consequences that stretched across every aspect of imperial doctrine and policy. "If they feed upon human emotion and thought," he said slowly, his voice heavy with dawning comprehension, "then every act of worship, every moment of fear, every surge of anger or despair strengthens them further. The very existence of our civilization provides them with sustenance." The Ultramarines Primarch could see how the Imperium's current structure, built upon foundations of faith, fear, and constant warfare, served the interests of their supposed enemies rather than humanity's own survival. The Emperor nodded gravely, acknowledging the terrible truth that his son had grasped with characteristic insight. "For 10,000 years, I have watched humanity feed its destroyers through the very emotions that make us human. Love becomes obsession under Slanesh's influence. Honor becomes blind rage that serves Khorne's purpose. Hope becomes the scheming ambition that feeds Tzeentch. Even despair and acceptance of suffering strengthen Nurgle's hold upon our species." The Master of Mankind gestured toward displays that showed psychic emanations flowing from human worlds into the warp, a constant stream of energy that empowered entities whose existence depended upon the continued suffering and passion of mortal beings. Magnus studied the psychic patterns with growing horror as he understood the true scope of the trap that ensnared all sentient life. "We are livestock," he breathed, his voice filled with the revulsion of one who had dedicated his existence to expanding human knowledge only to discover that consciousness itself was a form of bondage. "Every thought we think, every emotion we feel, every dream we dream, all of it feeds creatures that exist only to consume and corrupt what we create." The Crimson King could see how his own pursuit of forbidden knowledge had served Tzeentch's purposes, making him an unwitting agent of the very forces he sought to understand and defeat. Sanguinius felt tears gathering in his eyes as his prophetic gifts showed him visions of the psychic cycle that bound humanity to its destroyers, an endless loop of emotion and consumption that had persisted since the first human mind had achieved true consciousness. "No wonder the Eldar fell," he whispered, his voice filled with mourning for a species that had walked the same path toward transcendence, only to birth their own destruction through the very attempt to ascend beyond mortal limitations. They fed Slanesh through their pursuit of perfection until their patron consumed their entire civilization. Dawn's fortress builder instincts recoiled from the strategic implications of fighting an enemy that grew stronger with each victory their opponents achieved. "How does one defend against foes that benefit from the very act of resistance?" he asked, his voice carrying the frustration of a tactician confronted with a problem that conventional warfare could not solve. "Every battle we fight, every world we conquer, every act of courage or sacrifice, if all of it strengthens our enemies, then what hope do we have of ultimate victory?" The Praetorian could see defensive strategies crumbling before an enemy that derived power from the very emotions that motivated human resistance. The Emperor's response carried the weight of 38,000 years spent searching for solutions to a problem that had plagued sentient life since consciousness first emerged in the galaxy. "Conventional victory is impossible," he admitted, his words falling like a death knell upon the strategies and doctrines that had guided the Great Crusade. "Yet there is another path, not through destruction of our enemies, but through transcendence beyond the limitations that make us vulnerable to their influence." The Master of Mankind turned toward the Golden Throne, its gleaming surfaces reflecting possibilities that existed beyond the cycle of consumption that had trapped every previous attempt at galactic civilization. The Webway project was designed not merely to protect humanity from chaos corruption, but to starve the chaos gods themselves, the Emperor revealed, his voice carrying implications that reframed the entire purpose of his greatest work. Within the webway's protected passages, human consciousness would have evolved beyond the emotional patterns that sustain our destroyers. We would have become beings of pure thought and will, creatures of psychic energy that could no longer provide sustenance to entities that require the crude passions of mortal existence. The vision he painted showed humanity ascending to a level of existence where the chaos gods would become irrelevant rather than merely defeated. Guilliman's strategic mind raced as he began to understand the true scope of what had been attempted and what had been lost when Magnus's breach compromised the webway's defenses. The Codex Astartes, the administrative structures I've developed for governing imperial worlds, none of it addresses the fundamental problem, he said, his voice heavy with the realization that decades of careful work had been built upon flawed assumptions. We've been treating symptoms while the disease itself grows stronger with every passing day. The Ultramarines Primarch could see how the Imperium's entire governmental philosophy would need to be restructured if they were to have any hope of breaking the cycle that bound humanity to its destroyers. The Emperor's expression grew even more somber as he prepared to share the final and most terrible truth about the price that transcendence would demand. The Webway Project's completion would have required a sacrifice that goes beyond anything we have yet contemplated, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had been made in full knowledge of their cost. The Golden Throne's operation demands a consciousness capable of guiding an entire species through transformation, while simultaneously maintaining the psychic barriers that protect them from chaos interference. Such work cannot be sustained indefinitely, even by one who possesses the accumulated strength of 10,000 souls. Sanguinius felt his prophetic gifts surge, as visions of the Emperor's potential fate flooded through his consciousness, showing him images of his father, seated upon the Golden Throne, not in triumph, but in a form of living death that would preserve his consciousness long enough to complete humanity's evolution. You would become a martyr to our transcendence, the angel breathed, his voice filled with horror at the scope of the sacrifice that had been contemplated. The completion of the plan would destroy you as surely as any weapon wielded by our enemies. The Emperor acknowledged his son's vision with the calm acceptance of one who had long ago made peace with necessary sacrifice. The shamans who created me understood that their individual existence must end for something greater to be born, he said, his words echoing across millennia to connect his origins with his intended destiny. I have always known that my role was to shepherd humanity to transcendence, not to rule over them once that transcendence was achieved. The Golden Throne would have been both my greatest triumph and my final act of service to the species I was born to guide. Magnus felt the weight of understanding settle upon him like a shroud as he realized the true scope of what he had destroyed with his well-intentioned warning about Horus's treachery. The breach I created has made that sacrifice meaningless, he said, his voice hollow with despair at the magnitude of his failure. Without the Webway's protection, the transformation cannot proceed safely. I have condemned humanity to remain trapped in the cycle that feeds our destroyers, and I have made your sacrifice impossible to achieve. The Crimson King's astral form flickered with the pain of absolute remorse. Yet the Emperor's response carried hope rather than condemnation, his ancient wisdom finding possibilities even in the ruins of his carefully laid plans. The path we intended to walk has been blocked, but other roads remain open to those with the courage to explore them, he said, his voice carrying certainties that transcended the immediate crisis they faced. The Webway Project may be compromised, But the knowledge we have gained and the unity we are forging in this moment of revelation represent the foundation for approaches we had not previously considered. Dawn stepped forward, his architect's mind already working to envision defensive strategies that could protect humanity during any alternative attempt at transcendence. If the webway cannot provide the sanctuary we require, then we must create other forms of protection, he declared, his voice carrying the determination that had made him the Imperium's greatest fortress builder. The challenge is enormous, but it is not insurmountable if we commit our full resources to its solution. The Praetorian could see possibilities for mobile sanctuaries, protected fleet cities that could serve as shelters during the transformation process. The chamber fell silent as the four Primarchs absorbed the full weight of what they had learned about their enemy and the price that victory would ultimately demand. The war they had been fighting was not merely a contest between species or ideologies, but a fundamental struggle between existence and parasitic consumption that threatened all conscious life in the galaxy. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming opposition, they found themselves united by their father's vision of transcendence and their own determination to see humanity ascend beyond the limitations that had always constrained its growth. The Emperor stood before the golden throne, with the expression of one who saw both infinite possibility and terrible cost reflected in its crystalline surfaces. The revelation I have shared changes everything we thought we understood about our mission and our enemies, he said, his voice carrying the weight of millennia spent planning for this moment of truth. Yet it also provides us with the knowledge we need to forge new strategies and pursue transcendence through methods we had not previously imagined. The path ahead will be difficult beyond measure, but it remains within our grasp if we possess the unity and determination to walk it together. Chapter 7. The Suns Divided. The silence that followed the Emperor's revelations stretched like a taut wire between the assembled Primarchs, each processing the magnitude of what they had learned according to the nature that had shaped their individual perspectives. The Golden Throne Chamber had become a crucible where fundamental assumptions about duty, purpose, and the nature of victory itself were being tested against truths too vast for mortal comprehension. Yet even as they grappled with cosmic implications, the practical realities of leadership demanded immediate decisions about paths that would determine the fate of billions who remained ignorant of the forces that shaped their destiny. Guilliman was the first to break the contemplative quiet, his strategic mind having catalogued the implications of revelation with characteristic thoroughness. The knowledge we now possess changes everything. But should it? He asked, his voice carrying the weight of administrative responsibility that governed half the galaxy. The billions of Imperial citizens who labor in ignorance of these truths, do they have the right to know that their very existence feeds the entities that seek to destroy them? Would such knowledge liberate them, or drive them to despair that serves our enemies even more effectively than their current struggles? The Ultramarines. Primarch could envision the chaos that would follow if the truth about chaos were revealed to populations that had been carefully shielded from such knowledge for generations. The governmental structures I have spent decades perfecting assume that citizens can function effectively while remaining ignorant of the cosmic forces that threaten their survival, Guilliman continued, his voice growing heavy with the burden of decisions that would affect trillions of lives. Yet if those same structures inadvertently strengthen our enemies, then perhaps ignorance itself has become a form of treason against humanity's future. Dawn's response carried the pragmatic weight of one who had spent his existence turning theoretical fortifications into practical defenses against real threats. The Webway project represented our best hope for transcendence, but that hope died when its protective barriers were compromised, the Praetorian declared, his voice cutting through philosophical considerations to focus on tactical realities. The Daemon incursions continue, despite our efforts to contain them. Every moment we spend discussing possibilities is another moment our enemies use to consolidate their advantage within the very infrastructure that was meant to protect us. The fortress builder's instincts told him that the time for grand strategies had passed, replaced by the immediate need to salvage what could be preserved from the wreckage of their father's ambitions. We lack the resources to rebuild what has been lost, while simultaneously defending against threats that grow stronger with each passing hour, Dawn continued, his analysis painting a picture of strategic realities that brooked no argument. Perhaps the moment has come to abandon transcendence in favor of survival, to accept conventional warfare as our destiny rather than chase visions that may no longer be achievable. Magnus's astral form blazed with intensity as he rejected his brother's counsel of surrender, his consciousness focused entirely upon the possibility of redemption through service to the vision he had inadvertently damaged. I will not accept that the breach I created has doomed humanity to eternal bondage, he declared, his voice resonating with power that made the Golden Throne's crystalline matrices flicker in response. The Webway project can be repaired if we commit the necessary resources and accept the sacrifices that such reconstruction would demand. I have studied the damage patterns, analyzed the structural failures. The path forward exists for those with the courage to walk it. The Crimson King's expertise in dimensional mechanics allowed him to see possibilities that remained hidden from his brothers, pathways through the labyrinth of damaged passages that could be restored to their original function if sufficient psychic energy could be channeled into the reconstruction effort. My transgression created this crisis, and my knowledge offers the only hope for its resolution, Magnus continued, his form flickering as emotion threatened to disrupt the projection that maintained his presence among them. Grant me the opportunity to repair what I have broken, and I will demonstrate that transcendence remains within our grasp. Sanguinius stepped between his brothers with the grace that had always marked his movements, his perfect features reflecting the prophetic burden that granted him glimpses of futures that defied easy comprehension. The vision our father has shared resonates with truths that my gifts have always whispered, but never spoken clearly, the angel said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from beyond the boundaries of normal reality. Humanity's transcendence is not merely possible, it is inevitable if we possess the unity and determination to see it through. Yet even as he spoke words of support for the Emperor's vision, Sanguinius could not suppress the images that flooded through his prophetic consciousness, visions of costs that would be measured not in resources or effort, but in lives that would be sacrificed upon the altar of species-wide transformation. I have seen the prices that transcendence will demand, he admitted, his voice growing heavy with the weight of foreknowledge that none of his brothers could share. The path forward leads through valleys of death that will test every virtue we claim to possess. Billions will suffer, so that trillions might achieve a form of existence that surpasses their current limitations. The Emperor listened to his son's debate with the patience of one who had witnessed similar discussions across millennia of planning and preparation. Yet the urgency that pressed upon them all was not lost upon his ancient consciousness. Before he could respond to their concerns, the chamber's warning systems activated with strident alarms that spoke of threats detected at the very edges of the Sol system. Malcador materialized beside his oldest friend with the grim expression of one who bore news that would reshape the parameters within which all future decisions must be made. "My lord," the sigillite said, his voice cutting through the alarms with authority that commanded immediate attention. Long-range augury arrays have detected fleet movements that suggest coordinated assault upon Terra itself. The signatures match those of legions that should be engaged in campaigns at the galaxy's edge, yet they approach in formation that speaks of unified purpose rather than coincidental convergence. The ancient Psyker's expression left no doubt about the identity of the force that was approaching the throne world. The Emperor's response came not in words, but in a psychic pulse that silenced the alarms and focused the attention of everyone present upon the magnitude of the crisis they now faced. "Horus comes to Terra," he said simply, his voice carrying certainties that only omniscient perception could provide. "The War Master seeks to prevent the revelations I have shared from bearing fruit, to destroy the possibility of transcendence before it can threaten the Chaos gods who have claimed his allegiance." The statement fell like a thunderbolt upon the assembled Primarchs, confirming suspicions that none had dared voice. Guilliman felt his strategic mind reeling as he absorbed the implications of treachery that reached into the very heart of the command structure they had spent decades building. "If Horus has turned against us, then how many others have been compromised?" he asked, his voice hollow with the realization that the Great Crusade itself might be built upon foundations of corruption and deceit. The administrative networks, the supply chains, the communication systems, everything depends upon trust between Primarchs and their legions. If that trust has been broken, the Emperor's expression grew even more somber as he prepared to deliver news that would complete the destruction of illusions his sons had maintained about the loyalty that bound their brotherhood together. "Magnus is not the only son who has sought to warn me of approaching disaster," he revealed, his words carrying implications that struck at the foundations of everything the Primarchs believed about their shared purpose. "Others have fallen to chaos, their nobility twisted into instruments of destruction that will soon be turned against everything we have built." Dawn's hand moved instinctively to the pommel of his chainsword as warrior instincts responded to threats that conventional tactics could not address. "How many?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of one who needed to assess the scope of defensive preparations that would be required. "Which of our brothers have been lost to the enemy? And what forces do they command?" The Praetorian's mind was already racing through calculations of fortress defenses and strategic deployments, yet he understood that the approaching conflict would be unlike anything they had previously faced. The Emperor's response encompassed knowledge, gathered through observations that had been conducted in secret for years, intelligence about corruption that had spread through the ranks of his own sons while remaining hidden from those who might have acted to prevent its spread. The exact number remains uncertain, but the threat is substantial enough to require every resource we possess, he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had been made too late to prevent catastrophe. "The Webway project must be either completed or abandoned. We cannot afford to divide our efforts between transcendence and conventional defense." Magnus stepped forward with desperate intensity, his astral form blazing as he sensed opportunity slipping away with each passing moment. "Give me the chance to prove that repair is possible," he pleaded, his voice carrying the desperation of one who saw redemption disappearing beyond his reach. "The approaching fleet will require time to translate into real space and position itself for assault. During that interval, I can demonstrate whether the Webway project can be salvaged or must indeed be abandoned to focus upon immediate survival." The chamber fell silent as the Emperor weighed possibilities against probabilities, measuring the potential for transcendence against the certainty of immediate threat. His decision would determine not merely the fate of the Webway project, but the future trajectory of humanity's evolution and the nature of the war they would fight against enemies whose corruption had already reached into the heart of their own brotherhood. Sanguinius felt his prophetic gifts surge as visions of possible futures cascaded through his consciousness, showing him fragments of battles yet to be fought and choices yet to be made. In some timelines, the Webway project's completion elevated humanity beyond the reach of chaos forever. In others, its abandonment led to victories achieved through conventional means, but at costs that scarred the species for millennia. Yet in all the futures he could perceive, the approaching conflict would determine which path remained open to those who survived its conclusion. The unity we have forged through revelation must not be broken by disagreement about tactics, the angel declared, his voice carrying authority that transcended his position in the hierarchy of brotherhood. Whether we pursue transcendence or conventional victory, we must face the approaching storm together, our purposes aligned despite our differences about methods. His words resonated through the chamber like a bell calling warriors to battle, yet the divisions that separated his brothers remained unresolved. The Emperor stood before the golden throne, with the weight of millennia pressing upon his consciousness as he prepared to make decisions that would echo across the remainder of human history. The revelation that had united his loyal sons in understanding had also fractured them along lines of pragmatism versus idealism, immediate survival versus ultimate transcendence. Yet time itself was now the enemy, and the luxury of extended debate had been stolen by the approach of forces that sought to destroy any possibility of humanity's elevation beyond its current limitations. Chapter 8. The Traitor's Gambit. The translation of Horus's fleet into the Sol system registered across every augury array in the inner sphere as a violation of natural law that spoke to powers beyond mortal comprehension. Ships that should have taken weeks to reach Terra's orbital approaches emerged from warp space with a precision that defied the chaotic nature of Imperium travel, their hulls bearing the scars of battles fought in dimensions where reality itself became a weapon. The vengeful spirit led the armada with the terrible majesty of a fallen angel, its weapon batteries charged and ready, while demon entities wreathed its superstructure in flames that burned without consuming. This was not merely a fleet seeking conquest, it was an instrument of cosmic forces that sought to prevent humanity's transcendence at any cost. The Emperor felt his sons approach through bonds of blood and psychic connection that time and corruption could not entirely sever, the familiar presence now tainted with influences that made recognition a form of pain. Horus had been the greatest of his children, the War Master, chosen to lead the galaxy's conquest, while his father labored in secret to prepare humanity's future. Yet the being that commanded the approaching fleet was no longer the son who had stood at the Emperor's side during the earliest days of unity, but something else wearing his form, a vessel for powers that understood exactly what they sought to destroy. Within the Golden Throne chamber, alarms wailed as defensive systems that had protected Terra since the earliest days of the Imperium activated in response to threats that registered across multiple spectrums of perception. Guillemon's strategic mind immediately began cataloging the tactical implications of the fleet configurations he observed through real-time data streams, noting deployment patterns that spoke of unified purpose rather than the scattered approach that conventional invasion would require. The formation suggests coordinated assault upon specific targets, he reported, his voice carrying the weight of analysis that painted a grim picture of their defensive prospects. Dawn moved toward the chamber's tactical displays with the purposeful stride of one whose entire existence had been devoted to the art of fortification and defense. The Praetorians' enhanced perception processed information about ship classifications, weapon signatures, and approach vectors with the efficiency that had made him the Imperium's greatest architect of war. The force composition includes elements that should be engaged in campaigns across the galaxy's edge, he observed, his voice growing heavy with implications that spoke to treachery on a scale that defied easy comprehension. Either the Great Crusade has suffered catastrophic defeats, or multiple legions have abandoned their oaths simultaneously. The Emperor's response carried knowledge that had been gathered through psychic observation conducted across years of growing concern about corruption spreading through his own sons. The fleet carries more than merely mortal warriors, he revealed, his ancient consciousness perceiving entities that existed partially within the warp while maintaining coherence in real space. Demon allies accompany the traitor legions, creatures that should not be able to manifest so close to Terra's protective wards. The barriers that have shielded the throne world for millennia are being systematically weakened by powers that understand their construction far too well. Magnus studied the approaching fleet through his astral projection, his knowledge of dimensional mechanics allowing him to perceive the warp signatures that accompanied vessels that should have been entirely mundane in their nature. The corruption he observed went beyond simple allegiance to chaos. It represented fundamental alterations to the relationship between matter and energy that surrounded the traitor forces. The ships themselves have been changed, he reported, his voice filled with horror at the scope of transformation he was witnessing. Their hulls exist partially within the Imperium, granting them capabilities that no conventional fleet should possess. Before any of the assembled Primarchs could respond to Magnus's observations, the Chamber's communication systems activated without authorization, bypassing security protocols that should have prevented any external access to the most sensitive areas of the Imperial Palace. The voice that emerged from the speakers carried the familiar tones of brotherhood, twisted into something that spoke with authority no mortal throat should possess. Words that resonated with harmonics, drawn from realms where language itself became a form of weapon. Father, Horus's voice filled the chamber with presence that made the golden throne's crystalline matrices flicker in response to psychic emanations that should not have been able to penetrate Terra's defenses. I come to offer you a final opportunity to abandon the dreams that have already failed. The Webway project lies in ruins, its protective barriers shattered beyond repair. Yet still you cling to visions of transcendence that serve only to delay the inevitable. Surrender these illusions, and I will grant you the mercy of a swift ending to delusions that threaten everything we have built. The ultimatum struck the assembled Primarchs with the force of revelation as they realized the scope of knowledge that their fallen brother possessed about secrets that should have remained hidden from all but the most trusted servants of the Emperor's will. Sanguinius felt his prophetic gifts surge as he understood that the approaching conflict would be fought not merely for Terra's survival, but for the future of human consciousness itself. He knows, the angel breathed, his perfect features pale with the recognition of how thoroughly their father's plans had been compromised. Horus understands exactly what you were attempting to achieve. Guilliman's analytical mind raced as he processed the implications of intelligence that reached into the very heart of the Webway project, strategic information that should have been accessible only to those who had participated directly in its construction. If he possesses detailed knowledge of the infrastructure, then he also understands its vulnerabilities, the Ultramarines Primarch observed, his voice heavy with the realization that their defensive preparations were based upon assumptions that might already be obsolete. The approaching assault will target not just our military capabilities, but the foundation of our transcendence itself. The Emperor's expression grew even more somber as he contemplated the scope of corruption that had reached into the most protected chambers of his consciousness, knowledge that could only have been obtained through methods that violated the fundamental nature of loyalty itself. Chaos has sought to corrupt or destroy the Webway project since its inception, he revealed, his words carrying the weight of ancient conflicts that had been fought in secret, while the Great Crusade proceeded according to its public mandate. The entities that now command my fallen son's allegiance understand that humanity's transcendence represents their ultimate defeat, the severing of bonds that have sustained their existence since consciousness first emerged in the galaxy. Dawn moved to the chamber's defensive control systems with the urgency of one who recognized that preparation time was measured in moments rather than hours, his fortress builder's instincts activated by threats that conventional fortification could not entirely address. The palace's weapon systems are activating, but they were designed to repel conventional invasion rather than assault by forces that include demon allies, he reported, his voice carrying the professional assessment of capabilities that might prove inadequate to the challenge they faced. We require strategies that account for enemies who can manifest directly within our defensive perimeter. The Emperor acknowledged his son's concerns with the gravity of one who had spent decades preparing for conflicts that transcended the normal parameters of warfare, yet even his vast planning had not anticipated the speed with which corruption would spread through the ranks of his most trusted children. The immediate priority must be the containment of the Webway breach, he declared, his voice carrying authority that transcended the chaos of defensive preparations. Whether we pursue transcendence or conventional victory, we cannot afford to allow demon incursions to spread throughout the infrastructure beneath Terra. Magnus stepped forward with desperate intensity, his astral form blazing as he sensed opportunity approaching despite the magnitude of the crisis they faced. Grant me the resources and authorization I require, and I will seal the breach from within, he declared, his voice resonating with power that made the chamber's walls vibrate in sympathy. The damage I created can be repaired if sufficient psychic energy is channeled into the reconstruction effort, but the work must be completed before Horus's assault reaches the Webway passages themselves. The Crimson King's proposal carried implications that struck at the very heart of the choice between immediate survival and ultimate transcendence, a decision that would determine not merely the outcome of the approaching battle but the future trajectory of human evolution. Sanguinius felt visions cascading through his prophetic consciousness as he perceived the potential consequences of Magnus's sacrifice. Timelines where the Webway's repair enabled humanity's ascension, and others where the attempt failed catastrophically. The risk is enormous, Sanguinius said, his voice heavy with the burden of foresight that showed him possibilities too terrible to describe in detail. I have seen the prices that such work would demand, sacrifices that go beyond anything we have yet contemplated. Yet I have also seen the futures that become possible if the breach can be sealed and the project completed according to its original design. The angel's words carried the weight of prophecy that transcended mere tactical assessment. The Emperor studied his loyal sons as they prepared to face a crisis that would test every virtue they claimed to possess. Their unity forged in the crucible of revelation now put to the ultimate test by forces that sought to prevent humanity's transcendence through methods that included the corruption of his own children. The Webway project had been compromised, but the dream it represented remained within reach if they possessed the courage and determination to pay whatever price victory would demand. Outside the palace walls, the first elements of Horus's assault began their approach toward Terra's orbital defenses, demon-touched vessels moving with coordination that spoke to intelligence that transcended mortal understanding. The battle for humanity's future was about to begin, fought not merely for control of the throne world, but for the right to determine what form human consciousness would take in the millennia to come. The Emperor's plan had been revealed, but whether that revelation would enable transcendence or guarantee its destruction remained to be determined by choices made in the crucible of warfare that would reshape the galaxy itself. The Golden Throne hummed with potential as preparation for battle merged with the desperate hope that transcendence might still be achieved despite the treachery that sought to prevent it. Magnus's willingness to sacrifice himself for the chance to repair his transgression represented the same spirit that had motivated the ancient shamans whose souls had given birth to the Emperor himself. The understanding that individual existence must sometimes be surrendered so that something greater might survive and prosper. Chapter 9. The Battle for Truth. The first salvos of Horus's assault struck Terra's orbital defense platforms with force that shattered reality itself, demon-enhanced weaponry, tearing through void shields that had protected the throne world since before the birth of the Imperium. The attackers came not as conventional invaders seeking conquest, but as instruments of cosmic forces that understood exactly what they sought to destroy. Each weapon discharge carried the malevolent intelligence of entities that existed partially within the warp, their hatred for human transcendence made manifest in energies that sought to corrupt as much as they destroyed. This was warfare conducted on levels that transcended the merely physical, a battle for the very soul of humanity's future. Within the Imperial Palace, the loyal Primarchs took their positions with understanding that transformed their perception of everything they defended. Dawn coordinated the fortress's responses from the primary command center, his strategic mind now focused not merely upon repelling invasion, but upon preserving the infrastructure that could still enable humanity's transcendence. Every defensive position became a sacred trust, every weapon emplacement a guardian of possibilities that stretched beyond mere survival. The Praetorian's orders carried weight that his subordinates could feel, but not fully comprehend. They fought now for futures that existed only in potential. Guilliman led his forces through the palace's outer defenses with precision that had been refined by the revelation of what truly hung in the balance. The Ultramarines Primarch understood that conventional tactical doctrine was insufficient for a conflict where the enemy's ultimate goal was the prevention of human evolution itself. His warriors fought with dedication that transcended mere loyalty to the Imperium, their bolters and chainswords defending pathways to transcendence that most of them would never live to witness. Each position held was a victory against forces that sought to trap humanity within the cycle of spiritual bondage that fed their destroyers. Sanguinius took to the skies above Terra, with wings that caught the light of burning orbital platforms, his perfect form a symbol of human potential that demon entities sought to corrupt through proximity alone. The angel engaged horrors that should not have been able to manifest so close to the throne world, creatures whose very existence violated the natural laws that governed real space. Yet as his blade carved through their writhing forms, he felt visions flooding through his prophetic consciousness, glimpses of the golden age that humanity might achieve if the Webway project could be completed despite the chaos that surrounded them. The visions showed him children born within passages of living light, their minds capable of perceiving dimensions of reality that remained hidden from ordinary human consciousness. He saw fleets of exploration vessels traversing the galaxy through tunnels where distance became meaningless, carrying civilization to worlds that had never known the touch of conscious thought. Most precious of all, he witnessed the transformation of human nature itself, the elevation of consciousness that would make his species the rightful inheritors of everything the Eldar had abandoned in their fall to excess. Yet even as these golden possibilities filled his awareness, Sanguinius was forced to confront demon entities that whispered of different futures, timelines where humanity remained trapped within the cycle of spiritual consumption that sustained the Chaos Gods. They showed him visions of endless warfare, of civilization after civilization, rising only to fall when their psychic emanations grew strong enough to birth new destroyers. The battle he fought was not merely for Terra's survival, but for the right to escape a pattern that had repeated itself across the galaxy for millions of years. Deep within the webway tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace, the situation grew increasingly desperate as demon incursions multiplied with each passing hour. The breach that Magnus had created with his warning about Horus's treachery had become a wound that festered with malevolent intelligence, each attempt to seal it met by entities that understood the strategic value of maintaining access to humanity's transcendence infrastructure. Custodians fought and died in passages of golden light, their sacrifices buying time for evacuation, procedures that might preserve some portion of the network for future reconstruction efforts. Magnus's astral form blazed with intensity as he coordinated his desperate mission to reinforce the failing barriers, his consciousness diving into the damaged sections of the webway with determination that transcended the fear of personal destruction. The Crimson King understood that this might be his only opportunity to atone for the transgression that had endangered everything his father had spent millennia building. His psychic power flowed into the crystalline matrices that held the tunnel network together, seeking to strengthen bonds that had been weakened by his own catastrophic breach of their defenses. The work required precision that only one who had studied dimensional mechanics for decades could achieve, yet it also demanded raw psychic energy on a scale that threatened to burn out even Magnus's considerable abilities. Each barrier he restored came at the cost of mental strength that could not be easily replenished. Yet the Crimson King pressed forward with single-minded dedication. Behind him, demon entities pressed against reinforced positions held by custodians, whose golden armor gleamed with reflected light from passages that existed between the normal dimensions of space and time. The Emperor found himself torn between multiple crises that demanded his immediate attention, his consciousness divided between the defense of Terra and the preservation of infrastructure that remained crucial to humanity's future transcendence. Above ground, Horus's assault intensified with each passing hour, as traitor Legion forces established beachheads within the palace's outer defenses. Below ground, the webway breach threatened to spread corruption throughout the entire tunnel network, potentially destroying in hours what had taken decades to construct. Each decision the Emperor made carried consequences that would echo across millennia, yet the luxury of extended consideration had been stolen by enemies who understood the value of forcing choices under pressure. His power flowed between the upper and lower battlefields, reinforcing defensive positions above, while simultaneously strengthening the barriers that held demon incursions at bay below. Yet even the master of mankind possessed limits to what could be achieved through divided attention, and the strain of maintaining effectiveness on multiple fronts began to show in the flickering of barriers that had once seemed unbreakable. Captain General Constantin Valdor led his custodians through tunnel networks that had become a nightmare maze of shifting passages and manifested horrors, their guardian spears carving through entities that existed only to corrupt and destroy. The Golden Warriors fought with dedication that transcended mere duty, understanding that they defended not just the Emperor's physical form, but the infrastructure of humanity's potential elevation. Each passage they held was a victory against forces that sought to trap their species within the cycle of spiritual bondage that had destroyed every previous attempt at galactic transcendence. The custodian's armor gleamed with reflected light from tunnel walls that pulsed with energies drawn from dimensions beyond normal comprehension. Yet that same light revealed the scope of the damage that had been inflicted upon the network. Entire sections showed the scarring of demon fire, while others had been sealed with emergency barriers that represented temporary measures rather than permanent solutions. The warriors who died defending these passages would never witness the transcendence their sacrifices made possible, yet their dedication ensured that future generations might inherit possibilities that surpassed anything their ancestors had imagined. Space Marines from loyal legions joined the defense with understanding that had been transformed by their Primarch's shared knowledge of what truly hung in the balance. They fought not merely for the Imperium, as they had always known it, but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. Their bolters spoke with authority that transcended conventional warfare, each shot fired in defense of possibilities that most of them would never live to see fulfilled. The revelation that their Primarchs had shared with selected commanders spread through the ranks like wildfire, transforming duty into something approaching religious devotion. Magnus felt his astral form beginning to flicker as the psychic energy required for barrier reconstruction exceeded even his considerable reserves. Yet the Crimson King pressed forward with determination that bordered on desperation. He could see the patterns within the damage, understand the precise adjustments needed to restore stability to sections of the network that teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Each success brought him closer to redemption. Each failure deepened the wound that his transgression had inflicted upon humanity's future. The demon entities that pressed against his reconstructed barriers whispered of the futility of his efforts, painting visions of corruption that would spread throughout the entire network, regardless of his attempts at repair. They showed him futures where the webway became a highway for invasion rather than transcendence, where the tunnels of light became conduits for entities that sought to devour human consciousness from within. Yet Magnus rejected their prophecies with determination that drew strength from the very shame that drove his desperate mission. Sanguinius felt tears streaming down his perfect features as his visions showed him the true cost of the battle that raged throughout Terra's defenses. He saw custodians falling in tunnel networks that would never again carry the light of human transcendence. He witnessed Space Marines dying to defend infrastructure that might be beyond salvation, their sacrifices meaningful only if Magnus's mission succeeded against odds that grew longer with each passing moment. The angel understood that they fought not for certain victory, but for the mere possibility that humanity might escape the trap that had ensnared every other species that had sought to transcend its limitations. The battle for Terra had become something far greater than the siege of a single world. It was a conflict between the possibility of transcendence and the certainty of spiritual bondage that stretched across cosmic time. The loyal forces fought with understanding that transformed their perception of victory and defeat, their weapons serving causes that surpassed the mere survival of the Imperium they had always known. Each position held was a victory against forces that sought to prevent humanity's evolution. Each life lost a sacrifice upon the altar of possibilities that might never be realized, but could never be abandoned without betraying everything that made consciousness worth preserving. Chapter 10. The Father's Choice. The webway's death throes began with a harmonic resonance that penetrated every level of the Imperial Palace. Crystalline matrices that had maintained dimensional stability for decades, suddenly fracturing under stresses that exceeded their design parameters. What Magnus had managed to repair through desperate expenditure of his psychic reserves was proving insufficient against the relentless pressure of demon entities that understood exactly how to exploit the network's fundamental vulnerabilities. The barriers that held back the tide of corruption flickered like candle flames in a hurricane, each failure cascading through connected passages until entire sections of the tunnel network began collapsing into the raw chaos of the Imperium. Deep within the damaged passages, Magnus felt his astral form beginning to fragment as the psychic energy required to maintain the repairs exceeded even his considerable abilities. The Crimson King had succeeded in sealing the primary breach, reinforcing barriers that had seemed beyond salvation mere hours earlier. Yet victory had come at a price that threatened his very existence. The daemon entities that pressed against his reconstructed defenses sensed his weakness, their attacks intensifying as they sought to shatter not just the barriers he had created, but the consciousness that maintained them. The Emperor sensed his son's distress through bonds of blood and psychic connection that transcended the barriers between dimensions, yet his own attention was divided between multiple crises that demanded immediate resolution. Above ground, Horus's assault had penetrated the palace's outer defenses with determination that spoke to powers beyond mortal comprehension. Below ground, the webway network teetered on the edge of complete collapse, each failure bringing demon entities closer to the very heart of Terra's defenses. The choice that approached would define not merely the outcome of the current battle, but the future trajectory of human evolution itself. Sanguinius felt his prophetic gifts surge as visions of approaching catastrophe flooded through his consciousness, showing him timelines where Magnus's sacrifice succeeded in preserving the webway, and others where his destruction led to the project's complete abandonment. The angel could see the precise moment approaching when the Emperor would be forced to choose between his grand design and the life of his son, a decision that would echo across millennia, regardless of which path was chosen. In some futures, Magnus's survival enabled future attempts at transcendence, despite the current plan's failure. In others, his death sealed humanity's fate within the cycle of spiritual bondage that fed their destroyers. "Father," Sanguinius called across the chaos of battle as demon incursions erupted throughout the palace's lower levels, his voice carrying urgency that transcended mere tactical concerns. Magnus is trapped within the collapsing sections of the webway. His astral form cannot escape the passages he has sealed. The very barriers that preserve what remains of the network also prevent his consciousness from returning to his physical body on Prospero. Without immediate intervention, we will lose both the Crimson King and any hope of future reconstruction. The Emperor's response came not in words, but in a pulse of psychic energy that revealed the scope of the choice that destiny had forced upon him with cruel precision. To save Magnus would require abandoning the webway project entirely, sealing the tunnels permanently to prevent demon incursions, while simultaneously destroying humanity's best hope for transcendence. To preserve the project would mean accepting Magnus's destruction, sacrificing the son whose knowledge remained crucial to any future attempt at species-wide evolution. Neither choice offered the victory that years of planning had been designed to achieve. Horus's voice echoed through the palace's communication systems with triumph that carried harmonics drawn from realms where victory and defeat took on cosmic significance. "Father, I have breached your inner defenses and stand before the very heart of your delusions," the War Master declared, his words resonating with power that made the Golden Throne's crystalline matrices dim in response. "Your webway project crumbles even as we speak, its passages infested with the servants of gods you cannot defeat. Abandon these fantasies of transcendence, and I will grant you the mercy of ending this farce before more of our brothers die for dreams that were always beyond mortal reach. The Emperor emerged from the depths of the palace with an expression that carried the weight of decisions that would reshape the galaxy, his golden form radiating power that pushed back the shadows of corruption, yet could not dispel the fundamental nature of the choice he faced. Behind him, the sounds of battle echoed from tunnel networks, where custodians fought desperate holding actions against demon entities that sought to spread their corruption throughout the entire infrastructure of Terra's defenses. Each passage lost was a victory for forces that understood the strategic value of preventing human transcendence through any means necessary. Dawn stepped forward with tactical assessments that painted a grim picture of their remaining options, his fortress builder's instincts telling him that the time for desperate gambles had arrived. The webway's structural integrity continues to degrade despite Magnus's repairs, he reported, his voice carrying the professional detachment that masked deeper concerns about the scope of what they were losing. Our defensive positions can be maintained for perhaps another hour before the daemon incursions reach the upper levels of the palace. The choice must be made immediately. Preserve what remains of the project, or seal it permanently to prevent further corruption. Guilliman's strategic mind raced as he processed the implications of abandoning decades of careful construction, yet he could also see the terrible cost that preservation would exact upon forces that were already stretched beyond their limits. If we seal the webway, we lose humanity's best hope for transcendence, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of possibilities that would die with such a decision. Yet if we attempt to preserve it, we may lose everything, including the lives of those who remain loyal to the vision it represented. The choice may ultimately be between certain failure and the possibility of future success. The Emperor looked upon his loyal sons and saw reflected in their faces the same dedication that had motivated the ancient shamans whose sacrifice had given him existence, the willingness to surrender individual desires for the sake of something greater than themselves. Yet unlike those prehistoric heroes who had chosen death to preserve their species' future, the choice that confronted him offered no clear path to transcendence, regardless of which option he selected. The Webway project represented decades of labor, yet Magnus represented knowledge and loyalty that could not be easily replaced. Magnus's voice reached them from the depths of the collapsing tunnel network, his astral form flickering as demon entities pressed against barriers that grew weaker with each passing moment. "Father, do not sacrifice the project for my sake," he pleaded, his words carrying the weight of absolute remorse for the transgression that had created the current crisis. "Let my destruction serve some purpose, by preserving what can still be saved of humanity's transcendent future. The Webway project must not die because of my failure. Too much depends upon its completion for personal considerations to override necessity." Sanguinius felt tears gathering in his eyes as his visions showed him the consequences of accepting Magnus's sacrifice, timelines where the preserved portions of the Webway enabled future attempts at transcendence, but at costs that scarred the Imperial project for millennia. The price of preserving the network will be measured not just in Magnus's life, but in the trust that binds our brotherhood together, he said, his voice filled with prophetic certainty that transcended mere tactical analysis. If we abandon one son to save a project, we establish a precedent that will poison every future decision we make as a family. The Emperor stood before the entrance to the Webway passages with the expression of one who had spent 38,000 years preparing for moments of impossible choice. Yet this decision cut deeper than any previous crisis, because it forced him to choose between the mission that had defined his existence and the relationships that gave that mission meaning. The shamans who had died to create him had sacrificed themselves for the sake of their species' survival. Yet they had made that choice freely, rather than being abandoned by those who claimed to serve the same cause. "The Webway project ends today," the Emperor declared, his voice carrying authority that resonated through every level of the Imperial Palace, while simultaneously reaching Magnus's consciousness within the collapsing tunnel network. But it ends as a choice made freely rather than a defeat imposed by our enemies. We will seal the passages permanently, accepting the loss of Transcendence's infrastructure rather than the destruction of those who possess the knowledge needed to rebuild it in the future. The Emperor's power flowed into the tunnel network with intensity that made the very foundations of Terra tremble, not to preserve or repair, but to impose final closure upon passages that had consumed decades of careful labor. The Webway's golden tunnels blazed with light that transcended the normal spectrum of human perception, as dimensional barriers were reinforced beyond any possibility of future breach. Yet that same reinforcement cut off Magnus's escape route from sections that would soon cease to exist in any recognizable form. Magnus felt his father's power reaching toward him through the chaos of collapsing passages, not as energy meant to strengthen his defenses, but as a lifeline that could return his consciousness to the safety of his physical form on distant Prospero. The Crimson King understood that accepting that lifeline would mean abandoning the repairs he had fought so desperately to complete, yet he also recognized the love that motivated his father's choice to prioritize rescue over preservation. "I accept," he whispered, allowing his astral form to dissolve as the Emperor's power pulled his consciousness back across the galaxy toward the body he had left behind. The Webway passages sealed themselves with finality that spoke to forces operating beyond the normal constraints of time and space, their golden tunnels becoming barriers that no demon entity would ever breach again. Yet that same sealing destroyed infrastructure that had represented humanity's best hope for transcendence, reducing decades of careful construction to elaborate tombs that would preserve nothing but the memory of what might have been achieved. The price of Magnus's rescue had been paid not in blood, but in possibilities that would never again be within mortal reach. Horus's triumph echoed through the palace's corridors as he sensed the death of the project he had sought to corrupt or destroy, his voice carrying satisfaction that transcended mere tactical victory. "And so the dreams of gods die at the hands of love," he declared, his words resonating with power, drawn from entities that understood exactly what they had prevented. "You have chosen family over transcendence, Father, and in doing so, you have condemned humanity to remain trapped within the cycle that sustains our patrons forever. The Webway project is dead, and with it, any hope your species possessed of escaping the fate that has claimed every civilization that dared to reach beyond its limitations." The Emperor stood amid the ruins of his greatest work with an expression that carried both grief for what had been lost and satisfaction with the choice he had made, understanding that love itself represented a form of transcendence that no demon entity could corrupt or destroy. The Webway project had died to preserve relationships that gave meaning to the struggle for humanity's future, yet those same relationships ensured that the dream of transcendence would survive even if its current form had been sacrificed. Magnus lived, and with him the knowledge needed to forge new paths toward the evolution that remained humanity's destiny, despite the setbacks that threatened to make such evolution impossible. Chapter 11. The Pyrrhic Victory. The throne room of the Imperial Palace had witnessed many momentous occasions throughout the history of the Imperium, Yet none had carried the weight of cosmic significance that marked Horus's final approach to the seat of his father's power. The War Master strode through corridors littered with the bodies of loyalist defenders, his corrupted form radiating energies that spoke to allegiances that transcended mortal understanding. He had expected to find the Emperor bound to the Golden Throne, trapped by the necessity of maintaining barriers that held demon incursions at bay, while simultaneously fighting a war he could not hope to win through conventional means. Instead, Horus found something far more dangerous. His father standing free beside the sealed webway entrance, flanked by brothers who had been united by revelation rather than divided by the crisis he had created. The Emperor faced his fallen son, not with the rage that Horus had expected to find, but with a sadness that encompassed the loss of possibilities that stretched beyond the merely personal. The Master of Mankind understood that the confrontation approaching would determine nothing more than the manner in which humanity's transcendent future would be mourned. Yet even that limited scope carried weight that demanded his full attention. The Webway project lay in ruins, its passages sealed to preserve the life of one son at the cost of salvation for an entire species. Yet the relationships that had motivated that sacrifice remained intact, and those bonds would determine what form of victory might still be salvaged from the wreckage of his greatest ambitions. Magnus stood beside his father in his physical form once again, his consciousness having returned to his body on distant Prospero, before traveling to Terra with speed that defied the normal constraints of interstellar journey. The Crimson King bore visible scars from his passage through dimensions where reality became fluid, marks that spoke to prices paid for knowledge that had ultimately proven insufficient to preserve what he had sought to redeem. Yet his presence among his loyal brothers carried significance that transcended the physical. He represented the possibility of redemption achieved through sacrifice, a demonstration that love could triumph over ambition even when such triumph came at costs that scarred the victor as much as the defeated. Gilliman positioned himself to the Emperor's right with tactical precision that had been refined by decades of warfare. Yet his strategic mind understood that conventional deployments were meaningless in a conflict where the true objectives had already been lost or abandoned. The Ultramarines Primarch had spent his existence building governmental structures designed to sustain human civilization across millennia. Yet the revelation he had witnessed transformed his understanding of what civilization was meant to achieve. Victory in the approaching battle would preserve the Imperium as it currently existed, but it could not restore the possibility of transcendence that had been sacrificed to save Magnus from the consequences of his transgression. Dawn took position to the Emperor's left, with the same methodical approach that had characterized his approach to every fortress he had ever constructed. Yet the Praetorian understood that the defenses that mattered most in this confrontation were not physical barriers, but bonds of loyalty that had been tested by revelation and strengthened by shared loss. The fortress he now defended was not built from stone or steel, but from relationships that had survived the impact of truth, powerful enough to reshape the galaxy. The approaching battle would test those bonds one final time, determining whether unity forged in understanding could withstand the corrupting influence of powers that sought to turn loyalty into another form of bondage. Sanguinius spread his wings in a gesture that caught the light streaming through the throne room's windows, his perfect form serving as a symbol of human potential that demon entities had failed to corrupt despite their best efforts. The angel's prophetic gifts showed him fragments of the battle about to unfold, visions of violence that would settle nothing while simultaneously determining everything that remained possible for humanity's future. He saw timelines where victory led to millennia of conventional warfare against enemies that grew stronger with each passing generation, and others where defeat resulted in corruption that consumed the very ideals the Imperium had been created to preserve. Horus paused at the threshold of the throne room as he absorbed the implications of finding his father and brothers united rather than divided by the crisis he had orchestrated, his corrupted consciousness struggling to understand how revelation could lead to stronger bonds rather than the fragmentation he had expected to exploit. The plan that had driven his assault upon Terra was based upon the assumption that the Emperor's secrets would fracture the loyalty of his sons when exposed to scrutiny, yet the scene before him spoke to unity that transcended the deceptions that had shaped the Imperium's public doctrine. You have chosen to abandon transcendence for the sake of preserving relationships that were always meant to be temporary, Horus observed, his voice carrying harmonics drawn from entities that understood exactly what they had prevented. The Emperor's response carried the weight of 38,000 years spent guiding humanity through crises that had tested every virtue his species claimed to possess. Yet his words also reflected understanding that had been refined by the choice he had made to sacrifice his greatest work for the sake of his son's survival. The relationships we forge in service of transcendence possess value that transcends the goals they were created to achieve, he replied, his voice resonating with authority that needed no external validation. Magnus lives, and with him the knowledge needed to forge new paths toward evolution that may prove more sustainable than anything the Webway project could have provided. Horus felt the corrupting energies that surrounded him surge with frustration as he realized that his victory had become hollow in ways that his patron entities hadn't anticipated. The Webway project had been destroyed, but not through corruption or external assault. It had been sacrificed willingly by the very being who had labored for decades to complete it. The Emperor's choice represented a form of victory that chaos could not claim as its own, a demonstration that love itself could serve as a form of transcendence that no demon entity could corrupt or destroy. You speak of love as though it were a strength, Horus declared, his voice growing heavy with power, drawn from realms where such emotions were transformed into instruments of destruction. Magnus stepped forward with determination that had been purified by his passage through dimensions where shame became a form of enlightenment, his scarred features reflecting understanding that had been purchased through acceptance of responsibility for consequences that could not be undone. Love is the only strength that matters when all other forms of power prove insufficient, the Crimson King replied, his voice carrying certainties that had been tested in the crucible of absolute failure and emerged stronger for the experience. I destroyed the Webway project through my haste to warn our father of your treachery, yet that same love which motivated my transgression also motivated his choice to preserve my existence rather than the infrastructure of our transcendence. The battle that erupted within the throne room transcended the normal parameters of physical combat, as powers drawn from multiple dimensions clashed with intensity that threatened the very foundations of reality. Horus fought with abilities that had been enhanced by entities whose existence depended upon preventing human transcendence, his every blow carrying the weight of cosmic forces that sought to trap consciousness within cycles of consumption and decay. Yet the Emperor and his loyal sons fought with understanding that transformed their perception of victory and defeat, their weapons serving causes that surpassed the immediate goal of survival. Sanguinius engaged demon entities that materialized around Horus with grace that had been refined by his experience of confronting visions that showed him the golden age that might have been achieved through different choices. the angel's blade carved through corrupted flesh with authority that transcended mere skill, each strike serving as a rejection of futures where humanity remained trapped within the cycle that had destroyed every previous civilization that had sought to transcend its limitations. His wings caught fire that burned without consuming, their radiance pushing back shadows that had gathered to witness the final confrontation between transcendence and bondage. Gilliman fought with tactical precision that had been transformed by understanding of what truly hung in the balance, his weapons striking not merely at enemies, but at the very concept that conventional victory could satisfy the deeper needs that drove human ambition. The Ultramarina's Primarch had spent decades building administrative structures designed to govern scattered worlds, yet the revelation he had witnessed showed him that governance itself was meaningless without the vision of transcendence that gave direction to all other efforts. Each blow he delivered served as a declaration that humanity would continue to seek evolution even when the current path toward that goal had been blocked by circumstances beyond their control. Dawn fought with the same methodical approach that had characterized his construction of fortresses throughout the galaxy, yet his efforts were now directed toward defending concepts rather than positions, ideals that could not be protected through conventional fortification. The Praetorian understood that the true fortress was the unity that had been forged between his father and brothers through shared revelation, bonds that could not be breached by weapons or corruption, but only by the voluntary abandonment of the ideals they were meant to protect. Magnus fought with power that had been refined by his acceptance of responsibility for the consequences of his choices, his psychic abilities serving not as tools for personal advancement, but as instruments dedicated to preserving possibilities that remained accessible despite the setbacks they had suffered. The Crimson King understood that his redemption could only be achieved through service to visions that transcended his individual existence, yet that same understanding transformed his power into something that daemon entities could not easily corrupt or deflect. Horus felt the entities that had corrupted him beginning to withdraw their support as they recognized that victory achieved through his efforts would not serve their ultimate objectives, the destruction of the Webway project having been accomplished through choices that demonstrated virtues they could not claim as their own. The War Master found himself fighting not as the champion of cosmic forces, but as an individual whose personal grievances had been manipulated by powers that understood the strategic value of turning love into an instrument of destruction. The Emperor struck the final blow with power that carried the accumulated weight of 38,000 years spent preparing for moments when individual choice determined the fate of entire species, his weapon piercing through corrupted flesh to reach the consciousness that had been his greatest son before corruption transformed love into hatred. Horus fell not as a champion of chaos, but as a son whose nobility had been perverted by entities that sought to prevent transcendence through any means necessary, his death serving as both victory and tragedy for those who witnessed his destruction. The throne room fell silent as the echoes of battle faded, leaving only the Emperor and his loyal sons standing amid the wreckage of hopes that had shaped their existence for decades. Horus lay dead at their feet, yet his destruction provided no satisfaction to beings who understood that the true victory had been claimed by forces that fed upon the very emotions that made their triumph possible. The Webway project was gone, its passages sealed forever to preserve the life of one son at the cost of transcendence for an entire species. Magnus knelt beside his fallen brother, with grief that encompassed both personal loss and the recognition of possibilities that had died with Horus's corruption, understanding that redemption achieved through sacrifice carried prices that could never be fully calculated. The Crimson King had been saved from the consequences of his transgression, yet that salvation had been purchased through the abandonment of everything he had sought to preserve. Victory and defeat had become indistinguishable, their meaning dependent upon perspectives that transcended the immediate results of physical confrontation. The Emperor stood amid the ruins of his greatest ambition with an expression that carried both satisfaction with choices made and grief for futures that would never be realized, understanding that love itself had proven to be a form of transcendence that no external force could corrupt or destroy. The Webway project was dead, but the relationships it had been meant to serve remained intact, carrying within themselves the possibility that new paths toward evolution might yet be discovered by beings who possessed the courage to seek transcendence through unity rather than individual advancement. Chapter 12. The Weight of Truth. The aftermath of battle settled upon the Imperial Palace like a shroud of silence that carried the weight of possibilities lost and futures forever altered. The Emperor stood within the throne room where Horus's body had been removed, with the ceremonial reverence due to a fallen son, his golden form bearing wounds that spoke to the cost of choices made in the crucible of impossible decisions. Yet the injuries that marked his flesh were nothing compared to the deeper wounds that scarred his consciousness, the knowledge that humanity's transcendent destiny had been sacrificed to preserve relationships that gave meaning to the struggle for survival itself. The Webway project lay in permanent ruin, its passages sealed beyond any hope of restoration. Yet the bonds between father and sons had emerged stronger from the crucible of revelation. Magnus stood beside his father with features that bore the marks of his passage through dimensions where reality became fluid, scars that would serve as permanent reminders of the price paid for knowledge that had ultimately proven insufficient to preserve what he had sought to redeem. The Crimson King had been changed by his ordeal in ways that transcended the merely physical, his understanding refined by acceptance of responsibility for consequences that could never be undone. I have learned that some knowledge comes at prices too high for any individual to pay, he said, his voice carrying certainties that had been tested in the crucible of absolute failure and emerged tempered by wisdom. The Webway project might have succeeded if approached with patience rather than desperation. Yet such patience was a luxury that circumstances denied us. Gilliman moved through the palace's strategic planning chambers with purpose that had been transformed by revelation, his analytical mind already working to envision governmental structures that could serve an Imperium whose true objectives had been fundamentally altered by the knowledge they now possessed. The Ultramarines Primarch understood that the administrative systems he had spent decades perfecting were based upon assumptions that no longer matched the reality they faced. The Codex Astartes must be rewritten, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of understanding that reached beyond tactical doctrine to encompass the philosophical foundations upon which human civilization would be built. Our legions cannot serve an empire built upon ignorance when we ourselves possess knowledge that transforms the very meaning of conquest and governance. The Emperor acknowledged his son's insight with the gravity of one who had spent millennia preparing for moments when fundamental assumptions required radical revision. Yet he also understood that the knowledge they possessed carried responsibilities that extended beyond the immediate need for administrative reform. The truth we have shared among ourselves cannot remain confined to our brotherhood indefinitely, he said, his voice resonating with authority that encompassed not just the immediate crisis, but the longer struggle that stretched ahead of them. Humanity must be prepared for the reality of forces that seek to consume consciousness itself, Yet that preparation must be undertaken gradually to avoid the despair that would serve our enemy's purposes more effectively than ignorance. Dawn examined the palace's damaged fortifications with the methodical approach that had characterized his response to every crisis throughout his existence. Yet the Praetorian's attention was now focused not merely upon physical defenses, but upon the protection of knowledge that could either liberate humanity or destroy it, depending upon how such information was applied. The immediate threat has been contained, but the war itself continues on levels that conventional fortification cannot address, he observed, his voice carrying the professional assessment of one who understood that the enemy they faced operated through corruption rather than conquest. We require strategies that account for foes who grow stronger through the very emotions that make resistance meaningful. Sanguinius stood before the sealed entrance to the webway passages, with wings spread in a gesture that caught the light streaming through windows that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, his perfect features reflecting the weight of visions that showed him fragments of futures that would never be realized, alongside others that might still be achieved through different methods. I have seen the golden age that might have been born within those passages, the angel said, his voice filled with mourning for possibilities that existed now only in the realm of memory and dream. Yet I have also seen futures where humanity achieves transcendence through paths we have not yet imagined, roads that become visible only when we abandon the assumption that evolution must follow patterns established by species that came before us. The Emperor moved toward the Golden Throne, with steps that carried the weight of decisions that would echo across the remainder of human history, understanding that the device which had been designed to serve as humanity's gateway to transcendence must now be transformed into something entirely different, yet equally essential. The throne's purpose has changed, yet its importance remains undiminished, he declared, his voice resonating through the chamber as he prepared to assume responsibilities that would stretch across millennia. It will no longer serve as an anchor for evolution, guided through protected passages, but as a lighthouse that illuminates paths toward transcendence that must be walked without the shelter we had hoped to provide. Malcador appeared beside his oldest friend with the silent grace that had marked their partnership since the earliest days of unity. The ancient Psyker's staff blazing with silver fire that complemented the golden radiance emanating from the throne itself. "My lord," he said, his voice carrying the weight of millennia, spent as humanity's secret guardian, and the understanding that their mission had been transformed rather than abandoned. The Webway project represented one path toward transcendence, but it was never the only possibility available to our species. The knowledge we have preserved and the unity we have forged through revelation provide foundations upon which new approaches might be built. Magnus stepped forward with determination that had been purified by his acceptance of the prices that knowledge demanded from those who sought to wield it responsibly, his scarred features reflecting understanding that had been purchased through the willingness to sacrifice everything he valued for the chance to preserve what others treasured more highly. "Grant me the opportunity to serve this new mission," he requested, his voice carrying the humility of one who had learned to measure success not through personal achievement, but through contribution to purposes that transcended individual ambition. "My knowledge of dimensional mechanics remains intact despite the failure of the Webway project, and such expertise may prove valuable in discovering alternative paths toward the evolution we still seek to achieve." The Emperor's acknowledgement carried the warmth of forgiveness that had been tested in the crucible of impossible choice and emerged stronger for the experience. Yet it also reflected understanding that redemption could only be achieved through service to visions that demanded everything, while promising nothing beyond the satisfaction of contributing to humanity's survival. The new great crusade that we must now undertake will be fought not among the stars, but within human consciousness itself, he declared, his words carrying implications that reframed every aspect of imperial doctrine and purpose. We will guide our species toward transcendence, not through protected evolution, but through the gradual awakening of potential that exists within every human soul. Gilliman felt his strategic mind expanding as he grasped the scope of what would be required to implement such a transformation, the logistical challenges that would dwarf even the original Great Crusade, yet offered possibilities that conventional conquest could never provide. The administrative structures needed to support such an undertaking will require fundamental changes to every aspect of imperial governance, he observed, his voice carrying the excitement of one who saw opportunities for meaningful work despite the magnitude of the challenges they faced. We must create institutions capable of nurturing human potential rather than merely exploiting human resources, systems that serve evolution rather than simple expansion. Dawn studied the sealed webway entrance with the eye of one who understood that the greatest fortifications were built not from stone and steel, but from ideas and ideals that could withstand any form of assault, his fortress builder's instincts activated by the need to protect concepts rather than territories. The defenses required for this new crusade will be unlike anything we have previously constructed, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of one who had found challenges worthy of his abilities. We must build barriers that protect human consciousness from corruption, while simultaneously allowing that consciousness to grow beyond the limitations that currently constrain its development. Sanguinius felt his prophetic gifts surge as visions of possible futures cascaded through his awareness, showing him timelines where humanity achieved transcendence through methods that had never occurred to those who planned the Webway project, paths that became visible only when the assumption of shelter was abandoned in favor of approaches that embraced the risks inherent in all meaningful growth. The golden age we seek may prove more beautiful than anything we previously imagined, precisely because it will be earned through courage rather than protection, he declared, his voice carrying prophecy that transcended mere hope to encompass certainty drawn from the deepest levels of prescient understanding. The Emperor ascended the steps that led to the Golden Throne with the measured pace of one who had accepted a vigil that would stretch across eons, understanding that the device which had been meant to facilitate humanity's protected evolution would now serve as the focal point for a different kind of transformation that required constant guidance rather than temporary intervention. The crystalline matrices that surrounded the throne pulsed with energy that spoke to potential rather than limitation, possibilities that remained within reach despite the setbacks that had forced fundamental changes in approach and methodology. As the Emperor settled upon the throne that would become both seat of power and prison of responsibility, he felt the weight of 38,000 years of preparation converging with the knowledge that all previous planning had been merely prelude to the work that now began in earnest. The Webway project had been humanity's first attempt to transcend the cycle that trapped consciousness within patterns that served entities dedicated to consumption and decay. Its failure did not mark the end of such attempts, but rather the beginning of approaches that drew strength from unity rather than isolation, courage rather than shelter. The surviving Primarchs stood before their father as he assumed the burden that would define the remainder of his existence, understanding that they witnessed not the conclusion of their mission, but its true beginning. The revelation that had united them in knowledge of humanity's cosmic situation would serve as the foundation for efforts that spanned millennia, work that would be measured not in worlds conquered, but in souls awakened to possibilities that stretched beyond anything their ancestors had imagined possible. The chamber fell silent as the golden throne activated with energies that reached beyond the normal constraints of time and space, its crystalline matrices establishing connections with human consciousness across the galaxy, while simultaneously maintaining barriers that protected such consciousness from the entities that sought to exploit its vulnerability. The Emperor's vigil had begun, not as the death of hope, but as the transformation of transcendence from dream into active pursuit that would continue until humanity achieved the evolution that remained its destiny, despite all obstacles that sought to prevent such achievement. The weight of truth had been shared among those who possessed the strength to bear it, and from that sharing would come the gradual awakening of an entire species to potential that no external force could corrupt or destroy. The Webway project was dead, but the vision it had represented lived on in forms that drew strength from revelation rather than concealment, unity rather than isolation. Humanity's golden age would yet dawn, though it would emerge from darkness earned through struggle rather than light provided through protection.